The telegram sat unopened on the kitchen table for 3 days. Margaret Hayes knew what it said. She'd known since Tuesday morning when the carrier's boots stopped at her door, when his eyes couldn't meet hers, when his hand trembled passing her the yellow envelope. Now it was Friday, and the telegram remained sealed, because as long as she didn't read it, Thomas was still alive somewhere across the ocean. But we need to go back to the railway platform in Southampton, June 1944, where rain fell in sheets and a 22-year-old soldier held his mother's hands too tightly. "I'll come back, Mum. I promise you, I'll come back." Thomas Hayes had dark eyes that crinkled when he smiled, hands calloused from helping his father in the carpentry shop, and a habit of whistling "We'll meet again" while working. He'd enlisted the week after his 21st birthday, against his mother's pleading, because his best friend William had already gone, because the newspaper said they needed every able man, because staying home felt like cowardice even though it wasn't. Margaret had pressed a small photograph into his palm that morning, the one of them at Brighton Pier when Thomas was 7, both squinting into the sun, both laughing. "So you remember," she whispered. "So you remember what's waiting." The platform was chaos. Mothers crying, girlfriends clutching letters, fathers standing rigid with clenched jaws. Thomas's younger sister, Claire, 15 and trying not to cry, had given him a St. Christopher medal the night before. His father, Robert, had said nothing at breakfast, just gripped Thomas's shoulder once, hard, then left for the workshop early. 23 days, Thomas had said, his voice bright with false confidence. "Training in Portsmouth, then we ship out. I'll write every week, Mum, every single week." She'd memorized his face then, the small scar above his left eyebrow from falling off a bicycle at 9, the way his hair never sat quite right, the dimple in his right cheek. Mothers have instincts. Sometimes they know things before the world confirms them. The train whistle screamed. Soldiers began boarding, a river of khaki and duffel bags. "Thomas, I'll come back," he said again, and kissed her forehead. "I promise you, Mum. On my life, I'll come back." He climbed aboard, found a window, pressed his palm against the glass. Margaret matched it from the platform, her hand against his, separated by cold window and rain and everything about to come. The train lurched, moved, pulled away. She stood there long after it disappeared, rain soaking through her coat, until Claire came and gently took her arm. "He promised," Margaret whispered. In her pocket, the photograph of Brighton Pier was still warm from Thomas's hand. He'd given it back to her at the last moment, pressed it into her palm. "You keep it safe," he'd said. "I'll collect it when I'm home." 3 weeks later, he shipped out with the 50th Infantry Division. Destination, Normandy, France. Operation Overlord. His first letter arrived in July. "The French countryside is beautiful, Mum. You'd love the wildflowers. When this is over, we'll come here together. I promise." His last letter arrived August 14th. "We're moving toward a town called Falaise. Hot today, thinking of your Sunday roasts. Missing home, missing you. Love always, your Thomas." After that, silence. Then Tuesday, the telegram, the carrier's trembling hand. That was the moment Margaret Hayes learned that some promises, no matter how desperately meant, cannot be kept. Thomas had met death before he ever saw combat. It happened during training in Portsmouth late June, under a sky so blue it seemed obscene given what they were preparing for. William Carter, his best friend since childhood, the boy who'd shared his sandwiches at school, who'd learned carpentry alongside him, who'd convinced him that enlisting was the right thing, had been killed in a training accident. A rifle misfired during drills. One moment William was laughing about something stupid. The next, he was gone. Thomas had held him in those final seconds, felt the weight of a life leaving, watched light drain from eyes that had seen the same streets, the same sunsets, the same ordinary beautiful world that Thomas had seen. "Tell my mum," William had tried to say, but couldn't finish. That night, Thomas sat alone in the barracks and wrote 2 letters. One to William's mother, lying about how brave William had been, how he hadn't suffered. The other to his own mother, not mentioning William at all because he couldn't find words for what had broken inside him. What he wanted to write was, "I'm terrified. Mum, I made a promise I don't know how to keep." What he wrote instead, "Training is going well. Weather's been lovely. Missing your cooking." They shipped out 3 days later, crossed the channel on a transport vessel packed so tight you could barely breathe. Thomas stood on deck, watching England shrink behind them, wondering if William had known, in that last moment, that he'd never see home again. Wondering if there was a moment before death where you realized all your promises were about to break. The soldier beside him, A Scottish corporal named MacDonald with red hair and freckles noticed Thomas's expression. First time across? Thomas nodded. Aye, well, here's what they don't tell you in training. MacDonald lit a cigarette, hands steady despite the rolling sea. War doesn't care about promises. Doesn't care about mothers or sweethearts or the life you meant to live. It just takes. Your job isn't to come home. That's luck, that's chance. Your job is to do right by the men beside you while you're still breathing. I promised my mother, Thomas said quietly. MacDonald exhaled smoke into the salt air. Aye, we all did, son. We all did. They landed on Omaha Beach on June 7th, one day after D-Day, when the sand was still stained and the air still smelled of cordite and things Thomas tried not to identify. He stepped off the landing craft into ankle-deep water, legs shaking, the weight of his pack pulling at his shoulders, and thought, William never even made it this far. The first weeks were chaos, pushing inland through hedgerows, through towns with names Thomas couldn't pronounce. The sound became constant. Artillery, small arms fire, the wet smack of mortars and mud. Time moved strangely. Hours felt like minutes. Minutes felt like years. He wrote to his mother whenever he could. Short letters, always cheerful, always lying. France is beautiful. The people are grateful. I'm safe. I'm fine. I'm coming home. What he didn't write. I saw a boy today who couldn't have been 19. His name was Patterson, and he talked about his dog back home in Yorkshire. A spaniel named Copper. And then his head just... I can't write it. I'll never write it. I'll never tell you what I've seen. He kept the photograph of Brighton Pier in his breast pocket. Sometimes during the rare quiet moments, he'd take it out, look at his mother's face, frozen in that moment of happiness. 7-year-old Thomas grinning, gap-toothed and innocent. The world had been so simple then. The biggest fear had been getting home before dark. By August, something had changed in Thomas. His letters grew shorter. The chaplain noticed men like him, the ones who stopped talking about after the war, who stopped making plans, who moved through each day with the mechanical efficiency of someone conserving what little hope remained. You should write to your family, the chaplain suggested one evening. Tell them what's in your heart. Thomas almost laughed. What was in his heart? Guilt that he was alive when William wasn't. Terror that every sunrise might be his last. Rage at the universe for making him promise something he had no power to guarantee. I did, he lied. I write every week. On August 19th, they received orders to advance toward Falaise. A major push. The Germans were retreating but fighting desperately. Command said it would be over soon. Command always said that. Thomas cleaned his rifle that night with unusual care. Wrote a final letter to his mother, though he didn't know yet it would be final. Tucked the Brighton photograph back in his breast pocket, right over his heart. MacDonald found him before dawn. Ready, Hayes? Thomas nodded. He was never ready. None of them were, but he stood. He checked his gear, and when the order came, he moved forward with his unit into the gray August morning, toward a town he'd never heard of, carrying a promise he was starting to understand he might not keep. The town of Falaise burned. They entered at dawn on August 20th, through streets choked with smoke and rubble. The Germans were pulling back, but they weren't surrendering. They were making the Allies pay for every inch. Somewhere ahead, through the haze, artillery screamed back and forth in a conversation of mathematics and death. Thomas moved with his squad through what had been a residential neighborhood. Homes with shattered windows, a child's bicycle crushed under fallen masonry, a kitchen table standing perfectly intact in a room with no walls, 2 plates still set as if waiting for a meal that would never be served. They'd been taught to not look at these things, to focus on the mission, the objective, the next corner. But Thomas couldn't help seeing. Each detail was someone's life, interrupted mid-sentence. Hayes! Movement, 3 o'clock! He swung his rifle up, heart hammering, but it was only an old woman emerging from a cellar, hands raised, speaking rapid French, civilian, terrified, caught between armies. They directed her toward the rear, toward safety, though nowhere was truly safe. Sergeant Thompson gathered them in the shell of a church. 8 men, dust-covered and exhausted. Thompson was 35, ancient by military standards, a veteran of North Africa with eyes that had seen too much. Intelligence says there's a German position dug in near the town center. Machine gun nest, maybe a mortar team. We need to clear it before the main advance. He looked at each of them. Stay sharp. Stay together. We're going home when this is done. Understood? They nodded. Everyone always said that. We're going home. But Thomas thought of William, who'd believed the same thing. Patterson and his spaniel named Copper. The countless names and faces that had promised their mothers and never delivered. They moved out in pairs, using rubble for cover. The August heat was suffocating. Sweat ran down Thomas's spine under his pack. His throat was dust dry. Every sound was amplified. Boots on broken glass, distant explosions, the ragged breathing of men who'd been in combat for too many weeks. MacDonald was beside him, that Scottish corporal who'd spoken to him on the Channel crossing. They'd become friends in the way soldiers do, not through long conversations but through shared silence, through watching each other's backs, through the unspoken understanding that they might die together. Almost over, MacDonald muttered as they pressed against a wall, checking the next intersection. They're saying another few weeks, maybe a month. Then it's Berlin and done. You believe that? Doesn't matter if I believe it. Just need to believe it enough to keep moving. That was the trick, Thomas had learned. You didn't need hope for tomorrow. You just needed hope for the next 100 yards. The next corner. The next breath. They found the German position exactly where intelligence said it would be. A sandbagged machine gun placement overlooking the main square, manned by 4 soldiers who looked as young and terrified as Thomas felt. The firefight lasted 3 minutes. It felt like hours. Thompson was hit in the shoulder but kept moving, kept calling orders. Another soldier, Jenkins from Manchester, who collected stamps and talked about opening a shop after the war, took shrapnel in his leg. The German position went quiet. Then came the sound that changed everything. An engine, grinding gears, the unmistakable rumble of armor. Tank! Someone screamed. A panther appeared at the end of the square, turret turning with terrible deliberation toward their position. They had no anti-tank weapons. No cover heavy enough to stop an 88mm shell. Fall back, Thompson ordered. Now! They scattered. Thomas ran with MacDonald toward a side street. Behind them, the Panther's main gun fired, a sound like the world splitting open. The building they'd been sheltering against simply ceased to exist, transformed into a cloud of pulverized stone and metal. Thomas felt the blast wave slam into his back, throwing him forward. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision swimming. Tasted blood. Couldn't tell if he was hit or just bruised. MacDonald, he called out, voice sounding distant even to himself. No answer. He turned, still on his knees, and saw the Scottish corporal lying 20 feet away, half buried in rubble, not moving. The Panther was reloading, traversing its turret. Thomas had maybe 10 seconds. He could run. Should run. Thompson was screaming for them to pull back. The smart thing, the thing that might let him keep his promise to his mother, was to leave MacDonald and survive. But he thought of William dying in his arms. Of all the men he'd seen fall. Of the difference between living and being alive. Thomas got to his feet and ran, not away from the tank but toward MacDonald. He reached him just as the Panther fired again. Grabbed MacDonald's webbing, pulled with strength he didn't know he had. The shell hit somewhere behind them, showering them with debris. Thomas dragged MacDonald into an alley, around a corner, into the blessed relief of solid stone walls. MacDonald coughed, eyes opening. You bloody idiot! Yeah, probably. They lay there breathing hard while the battle raged outside. Thompson's voice crackled on the radio. Fall back to secondary position. Fall back! Thomas helped MacDonald to his feet. Together, limping and bleeding, they made their way through the ruined town toward the rally point. Behind them, Falaise continued to burn. That night, in a barn converted to an aid station while medics worked on the wounded, MacDonald found Thomas. You should have left me. Thomas shook his head. Couldn't. Why? You've got someone waiting. That mother you mentioned. I've got nobody. That's exactly why I couldn't leave you, Thomas said quietly. Someone has to make it home. If it's not me, maybe it can be you. MacDonald was silent for a long moment. Then, what's her name? Your mum, Margaret, right then. When I get home, if you don't, I'll find her. I'll tell her you were brave, that you kept your promise as best any man could. Thomas looked at the photograph from Brighton Pier, now creased and stained with mud. His mother's smile, his younger self's joy. A world before war. Tell her I tried, he said. Tell her I really tried. They advanced toward the German lines for 3 more days. The countryside around Falaise had become a graveyard of machines and men. Burned-out tanks sat like monuments to futility. The air carried the smell of smoke, cordite, and things nobody spoke about. Thomas moved through it all with the mechanical precision of someone who'd stopped thinking about survival and started thinking only about duty. August 22nd. Hot and clear. The kind of day that should have been spent at the beach or in a garden. Not here, not this. Their company had been reduced to half strength. Thompson was evacuated with his shoulder wound. Command sent a new lieutenant, barely 23, fresh from officer training, still believing the manual over experience. They all recognized the type. Eager, idealistic, dangerous. We're punching through their rear guard, the lieutenant explained, pointing at a map as if war was geometry. Intelligence indicates minimal resistance. We secure this crossroads, we cut off their retreat. MacDonald caught Thomas's eye. They both knew what minimal resistance usually meant. The crossroads was a junction of two farm roads, bordered by wheat fields and a small grove of trees. Peaceful, almost beautiful. The kind of place Thomas imagined bringing his mother someday, after the war, to show her France wasn't all ruins and death. They approached in spread formation, moving cautiously despite the lieutenant's confidence. Thomas had learned to trust his instincts, the crawling sensation between his shoulder blades, the way silence could feel wrong, the quality of light that suggested hidden watchers. Halfway across the field, the sensation grew stronger. "Something's not right," he murmured to MacDonald. The Scottish soldier nodded. "Aye, too quiet. They never saw the mine." Thomas only knew he'd stepped wrong when the world turned white and loud and spinning. The blast lifted him, threw him backward, erased time. When awareness returned, could have been seconds or minutes, he was on his back, staring at impossibly blue sky, ears screaming with tinnitus. He tried to move. Couldn't. Looked down and saw blood. Too much blood. His left leg twisted in a way legs shouldn't twist. No pain yet? Shock, probably. The pain would come. "Medic!" Someone was screaming. "Medic!" Faces appeared above him. MacDonald, pale and frantic. A medic, barely older than Thomas, hands already working. The lieutenant looking sick. "You're okay, Hayes," MacDonald lied, holding Thomas's hand. "You're going home, mate. This is your ticket out. You're going home." Thomas tried to speak. Couldn't. Everything was fading at the edges, going gray and distant. He thought about the promise he'd made on that rainy platform. Thought about his mother's face pressed against the train window. The photograph in his breast pocket. The medic was applying a tourniquet. Working fast, but Thomas could see it in his eyes. The calculation, the assessment, triage, priority, chance of survival. "Stay with me," MacDonald said, squeezing Thomas's hand. "Thomas, stay with me." But Thomas was drifting now, pulled by currents he couldn't fight. The sky above was so blue. Like that day in Brighton, in the photograph. His mother had bought him ice cream. They'd watched the waves together. He'd been 7, and the world had been simple and kind. "Tell her," Thomas whispered, forcing the words through failing breath. "Tell her I tried to keep my promise." "No," MacDonald said fiercely. "You tell her yourself. You're going home, you hear me? You're—" The clearing went quiet except for distant artillery. The medic sat back, hands still. The lieutenant turned away. MacDonald kept holding Thomas's hand, kept talking to him, kept insisting he'd be fine, even as the light left Thomas's eyes, and the war claimed one more soldier who'd promised to come home. Thomas Hayes died at 2:47 p.m. on August 22, 1944, in a wheat field outside Falaise, France. He was 22 years old. In his breast pocket, they found a photograph. A woman and a boy at Brighton Pier, smiling in the sun. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Margaret Hayes held it in her hands for 3 days, unable to open it, because opening it would make it real. On Friday, her husband Robert finally took it from her, opened it with shaking hands, and read the words that confirmed what she'd known in her bones since that moment at the railway platform. "The War Office regrets to inform you. Claire, now 16, held her mother while she wept." Robert stood at the window, shoulders shaking, too devastated to cry properly. The photograph from Brighton Pier sat on the mantel, waiting for Thomas to collect it as he'd promised. He never would. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Not from Thomas, but from someone named MacDonald, a Scottish corporal who wrote with careful words about bravery and duty and sacrifice, who described how Thomas had saved his life days before he died, who promised that Thomas had been thinking of home in his final moments. "He asked me to tell you he tried to keep his promise," MacDonald wrote. "He tried with everything he had. I'm so deeply sorry I couldn't bring him home to you." Margaret read the letter until she'd memorized every word. Then she wrote back, thanking MacDonald for being there, for holding her son's hand, for making sure he hadn't died alone. The war ended 9 months later. Robert returned to his carpentry shop, but never whistled while working again. Claire grew up and married a teacher, gave her mother grandchildren, named her first son Thomas. Margaret lived another 32 years until 1976, and never removed the photograph from the mantel. She kept the St. Christopher medal Claire had given Thomas, kept his letters with their careful lies about how safe he was, how he was coming home, kept that final letter from MacDonald, creased from being read and read and read again. Sometimes, on summer days when the light fell just right, Margaret would sit in the garden and remember Thomas at 7, gap-toothed and laughing, believing the world was good and promises could always be kept. She'd remember his hands, calloused from carpentry, pressing against the train window, his voice saying, "I promise you, Mum, I'll come back." She never blamed him for the broken promise. How could she? He'd tried. He'd tried with everything he had. In 1968, Margaret traveled to France. Claire and her husband came with her. They found the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Bayeux, where row upon row of white headstones stood in perfect formation, each marking a life interrupted, a promise broken, a mother's heart shattered. Thomas's stone was in the third row, simple, clean. His name, his age, his regiment, his death date. Margaret knelt and placed the Brighton Pier photograph against the headstone, traced his name with trembling fingers, whispered the words she'd carried for 24 years. "I know you tried, my darling. I know you tried." She stayed until sunset, until Claire gently helped her up, until the cemetery keeper came to close the gates. Before leaving, Margaret looked back one last time at the endless rows of white stones, each one representing a soldier who'd promised to come home, a mother who'd waited, a future that would never arrive. The world had moved on. The war was history now, stories in textbooks, dates to memorize. But for Margaret Hayes, for all the mothers who'd watched trains pull away carrying their sons, it would never be history. It would always be that moment, rain on the platform, a promise whispered, a hand pressed against cold glass. Some promises can't be kept, no matter how desperately they're meant, but they're still worth making. Because in the end, it's not about whether we succeed in keeping every promise. It's about trying, about loving enough to risk the pain of loss, about being human in a world that too often forgets what that means. Thomas Hayes kept his promise the only way war allowed him to, by fighting for a world where other sons might come home, where other mothers might not have to wait forever for trains that would never arrive. His promise was broken, but his love never was. Who would you still wait for, even if the world was burning? If this story touched your heart, share it so their memory lives on. Let these stories remind us what sacrifice truly means and what peace is worth.